April 1945. The thunder of war still echoed across Europe, but the end was near. Imagine this: Berlin in ruins, smoke curling into the gray sky, the air thick with dust and fire. And on top of the Reichstag, not the red Soviet banner, but the stars and stripes. American soldiers stand among the rebel, exhausted and victorious. They light cigarettes, pass around canteens, and stare at the city that had been the heart of the Nazi Empire. From the west, columns of Shermans rumble forward. From the east, Soviet T-34s halt on the outskirts, their crews staring in disbelief. The war in Europe has been won, but a new conflict is already waiting to begin. What if America had invaded Berlin first? By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler was hiding in his bunker, and German resistance was little more than scattered divisions trying to delay the inevitable. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr, and shattered the last coherent German defenses. Ahead lay Berlin, less than 200 miles from the American spearheads. But instead of ordering a direct advance on the capital, General Dwight D. Eisenhower chose caution. His armies would turn south to clear Bavaria and link up with the Soviets along the River Elbe. The decision seemed logical at the time. Why risk tens of thousands of lives for a symbolic prize that political agreements had already assigned to Stalin? Yet that single choice would decide whose flag flew over Europe's most infamous city. For some, it was the most consequential what-if of the entire war. Among the loudest critics was George S. Patton, the hard-driving commander of the U.S. Third Army. To him, war was momentum, and Berlin was the ultimate finish line. In late March 1945, he told his staff, "We can take the city in 10 days. Let me go." Eisenhower refused. "That's a political question," he replied. "Let the Russians have it." Patton seethed. He knew that every mile the Red Army advanced would shape the post-war world. "If we fight them later," he warned, "we'll have to do it farther west or fight over the same ground again." In this alternate history, Eisenhower changes his mind. Maybe pressure from Churchill, fearful of Soviet domination, convinces him. Maybe reports of Stalin's brutal advance through Eastern Europe spark concern in Washington. Whatever the reason, on the first days of April 1945, the order goes out. Third Army, Berlin is your objective. The assault begins with thunder. American bombers pound the highways leading to the German capital. Bridges over the Elbe are seized intact by airborne troops dropped in daring nighttime operations. Patton's armored divisions surge eastward, engines roaring, crews barely stopping to sleep. Every village they pass is filled with dazed civilians waving white flags. German soldiers surrender by the thousands. The roads clog with refugees and burning vehicles. But there is no time to slow down. The Soviets are coming from the opposite direction, their artillery already audible beyond the horizon. Patton drives his men mercilessly. Fuel trucks race behind the tanks, ammunition convoys thunder forward under constant Luftwaffe raids that are more desperate than dangerous. In the distance, the glow of Berlin lights the night sky. American pilots report entire districts burning. For every mile gained, the radio crackles with reports of Soviet forces crossing the Oder. The race is now official, one empire dying, two new ones rising, both determined to reach the same city first. Inside Berlin, chaos reigns. The remnants of Hitler's army dig trenches on street corners. Civilians prepare for the apocalypse. Propaganda still claims that miracle weapons will save the Reich, but even the most loyal no longer believe. Yet as American armor approaches from the west, a new rumor spreads. The Americans are coming before the Russians. Some welcome it, others fear it. Goebbels orders executions for anyone caught displaying white flags. As Patton's lead elements reach the outskirts, the first encounters with Soviet scouts occur. They are not enemies, yet. But both sides watch each other cautiously, fingers near triggers. In the ruins between them lies the city that will decide the future of Europe. Berlin was dying. Smoke rose from the city in endless black columns, curling over shattered streets and the skeletal remains of buildings that had once defined an empire. The people inside were ghosts, starving, terrified, trapped between two advancing armies. The Nazi leadership still clung to power through madness and fear. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to accept reality. He believed the Allies would fracture before reaching his capital. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. From the west, the roar of engines announced the arrival of the U.S. Third Army. The men were exhausted, covered in the dust of hundreds of miles of advance, but adrenaline drove them forward. Every soldier knew what was at stake. They weren't just fighting for victory, they were racing history itself. Above them, waves of Thunderbolts and Mustangs swept the sky clear of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe had become a ghost, its final missions flown by boys barely old enough to shave. American paratroopers held bridges across the Elbe, while engineers rushed to repair those destroyed by retreating Germans. Patton's voice echoed through radio channels, Berlin or bust. German resistance stiffened as the Americans neared the capital. Waffen-SS units, loyal to the death, defended every village, every crossroad. But even they were shadows of their former strength. Underfed, underarmed, led by officers more fanatical than capable. Each encounter cost time and fuel, and every hour mattered. Soviet artillery could already be heard to the east, like distant thunder rolling closer. The men of the Third Army pushed harder, knowing that whoever reached Berlin first would shape the peace that followed. By mid-April, the American spearhead reached Potsdam, less than 20 kilometers from the city center. Recon units reported Soviet patrols across the river. The two armies, allies in name, stared at each other through binoculars across a landscape of ruin. Officers on both sides exchanged nervous radio messages, pretending cooperation while maneuvering for position. Neither wanted to be the one to fire the first shot. Yet everyone understood. One mistake, one misunderstanding, and the alliance could collapse overnight. Inside Berlin, the mood turned surreal. Nazi officials burned documents by the ton. Goebbels gave speeches to empty rooms. Civilians poured into cellars, praying the approaching tanks belonged to the Americans, not the Soviets. They had heard the rumors, stories of revenge, of atrocities in the East. For many Berliners, the sight of American stars on the horizon was a flicker of hope in a city without light. On April 21st, Patton ordered his final push. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the assault from the southwest, blasting through the outer defenses with devastating artillery fire. The German lines cracked, and the Americans poured through. Streets once filled with parades of Nazi banners were now rivers of smoke and rubble. The stars and stripes painted on American tanks reflected in shattered windows as columns advanced block by block. By nightfall, the first American units reached the Tiergarten. The Reichstag loomed ahead, scarred, silent, surrounded by barricades of stone and steel. Snipers fired from its broken windows, machine guns rattled from the Brandenburg Gate. Patton's men fought through the night, illuminated by the flames of the burning city. Civilians huddled in subway tunnels, listening to the echoes of battle above them, not knowing which language victory would speak when morning came. At dawn, April 23rd, the final assault began. American artillery leveled the government quarter, and infantry stormed the Reichstag. Inside, the last defenders, SS, Hitler Youth, and foreign volunteers, fought to the end. Grenades rolled across marble floors, smoke filled the halls once used for Nazi ceremonies. After hours of brutal combat, the building fell silent. A squad of exhausted soldiers climbed to the rooftop. One of them, Sergeant William Hayes from Ohio, carried a folded flag under his jacket. Together, they raised it above the ruins. For the first time in history, the American flag flew over Berlin. Cheers echoed through the streets below, mixed with disbelief. Somewhere under the city, Hitler's bunker shook from nearby explosions. Realizing the end had come, he retreated deeper underground. For the men of the Third Army, there was no time to celebrate. Reports flooded in. Soviet forces were crossing the river in massive numbers. Eisenhower's headquarters demanded restraint. Washington feared an open confrontation. But on the front line, restraint was impossible. Soviet tanks appeared on the eastern horizon, their red stars glinting through the haze. American and Soviet units met amid the rubble, guns trained on one another. Officers tried to negotiate, but tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. The world held its breath. One shot, one spark, and the alliance that defeated Hitler could ignite the next world war. Berlin held its breath, and so did the world. The stars and stripes rippled over the Reichstag, while, a few streets away, red banners hung from smashed balconies and draped across knocked-out trams. American MPs set up makeshift checkpoints with overturned streetcars and coils of barbed wire. Soviet forward detachments stopped on the far side of canals and parks, their tank commanders staring through periscopes at GIs crouched behind sandbags. In the space of a single night, allies had become rivals, and the city turned into a chessboard where every intersection could trigger history. Civilians crept out of cellars waving white cloth, only to herded back by bursts of warning fire from both directions. There was no front line, only an uneasy seam where two victories met. The first shots came not from malice, but from fear. Near Alexanderplatz, a Soviet scout car rattled into a street already claimed by an American platoon. Orders in English and Russian collided in the dust. A nervous finger jerked, a rifle cracked. The exchange lasted 20 seconds. 4 men fell, and the silence afterward felt louder than the gunfire. Radios across Berlin lit up with frantic voices. "Hold your fire. Do not escalate. You will not, repeat, will not initiate hostilities." Field officers improvised hand signals, chalk arrows on walls, and hasty corridors where stretcher bearers from both sides could pass. But control was an illusion. Every squad leader in the ruins understood that the next misunderstanding could tip the world into a new war before the old one was even officially finished. News raced west to Eisenhower's headquarters and east to Zhukov's. Eisenhower ordered restraint. No American soldier was to advance beyond the line secured that morning. Zhukov, furious that the prize city had slipped away, demanded that Soviet formations, quote, cooperate tactically while correcting the line, phrases his subordinates read as permission to probe. Between these two interpretations lay street corners, alleys, and stairwells where teenagers with Panzerfausts had died only days before. Now veterans of Stalingrad and the Bulge measured one another at 50 yards. They shared a hatred for the Nazis and nothing else. In Washington, the crisis hit a capital in transition. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. Harry Truman, only weeks into the presidency, faced a knife-edge decision he'd never sought. His advisors split down familiar lines. One camp urged a firm stance. Berlin in American hands would anchor a free Germany and blunt Stalin's reach. Another camp warned that fighting the Soviets in the rubble of a dead city would cost tens of thousands of lives and shatter the Allied victory. Across the Atlantic, Churchill urged strength. If you hold Berlin, he argued, you hold the terms. But British divisions were exhausted, their logistics stretched, and their public weary of sacrifice. Power on the ground belonged to the two giants staring at each other across the Spree. Inside Berlin, ordinary people tried to decode the new reality. Rumors swarmed like flies. Some claimed the Americans would airlift bread to every neighborhood they controlled. Others whispered that the Soviets would cut the water and starve the West into submission. Mothers made lists of relatives in the east and west half that wasn't yet called West. Shopkeepers reopened behind shattered counters, taking cigarettes as currency. Priests and doctors crossed improvised checkpoints with armbands and handwritten passes signed by American captains and Soviet majors. Each pass was valid until some other officer, sweating in another doorway, decided it wasn't. Patton argued for a clean, defensible boundary. Draw the line on rivers and rail yards, he said, and back it with armor. Eisenhower disagreed. He wanted liaison teams, flagged traffic routes, and a promise, not yet called a guarantee, that the Soviets could pass through to hunt remaining German units east of the city. On paper, both sides agreed. On the streets, patrols jostled, maps didn't match, and every flag planted on a rooftop attracted rifle scopes like magnets. One evening, a Soviet political officer marched a squad to tear down an American banner from a courthouse dome. A U.S. lieutenant intercepted them on the stairs. His men crouched along the corridor with Thompsons aimed and unblinking. After a minute that lasted a century, both officers lowered their hands at the same time. The flags remained where they were, two colors on one skyline. Propaganda arrived faster than food. Loudspeakers and leaflets proclaimed that the Americans had liberated the heart of fascism and would protect families from vengeance and chaos. Soviet loudspeakers answered that the Red Army had broken the spine of Hitlerism and would not be robbed of the victory bought at Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Vistula. The same ruined boulevards carried different stories depending on which language you heard first. When relief trucks finally rolled in, American rations in the West, Soviet field kitchens in the East, hungry Berliners blessed whoever fed their children and kept their opinions to themselves. The Wehrmacht's last pockets still fought in scattered arcs south and north of the city. For a strange brief moment, Americans and Soviets coordinated artillery on common German targets while glaring at each other over city blocks. At Tempelhof, American engineers surveyed the runway under sniper fire, calculating whether transport planes could land if the roads were cut. To the east, Soviet sappers pushed pontoon bridges across canals, not for the Germans anymore, but to ensure they could maneuver if things turned hot. Planners on both staffs scribbled contingencies with innocuous names and grim arithmetic. Then came the second incident, bigger and harder to bury. A Soviet tank column, reading a map that contradicted the one on the American side, attempted to pass north through a boulevard the U.S. command had designated a secure logistics route. MPs blocked the way. Harsh words became shoves. Shoves became warning shots. The tank commander fired a short burst over the heads of the Americans to clear the street. A bazooka team, adrenaline overriding orders, answered with a single round that smashed against the turret without penetrating. For 10 seconds, the world tilted. The next decision belonged to the Soviet captain standing on the engine deck, his coat snapping in the wind. He raised his hand, held it there, and shouted his men down. Engines idled. The MPs lowered their weapons. After an hour of red-faced negotiation, the tanks turned back. Later, both commands reported a navigation misunderstanding. Everyone understood it had been a rehearsal for disaster. Stalin watched from Moscow, silent and calculating. If Berlin stayed in American hands, his bargaining position at the coming peace talks would shrink. If he ordered a frontal assault, the Red Army would bleed again within sight of victory, and the British might be pulled back in. He chose the long game. Accept the fact on the ground, probe elsewhere, and make the Americans pay for every day they held their prize. Soviet rail traffic to the city throttled down. Coal shipments paused. Bridges went under repair. It was blockade by paperwork, a pressure that didn't fire a shot but squeezed just the same. Truman, briefed on the delays, told his generals to prepare an answer that stopped short of war. The word airlift crept into staff meetings, still theoretical, still untested at the scale a city would demand. Pilots nodded grimly. The skies over Germany were theirs, but weather and logistics were enemies that couldn't be negotiated with. Patton scoffed at supply by wings. "We can drive anything through with tanks," he said. Eisenhower shook his head. Tanks would start a war. Airplanes might prevent one. And so the pattern of a new era emerged from the smoke of the old. Berlin became divided by habits before it was divided by walls.
West of certain streets, jazz crackled on army radios, and Hershey bars sweetened a market economy born overnight. East of others, the language of victory was ration cards, committees, and banners printed with promises about the people's future. Spies made first contact in cafes with broken windows. Officers discovered that cooperation could be traded for time, and time could be traded for leverage. The city learned to live with two clocks, set to the same hour and counting toward different destinies. For the soldiers who had raised the American flag on the Reichstag, the triumph turned strangely quiet. They patrolled their blocks, shared cigarettes with British liaison sergeants, and watched Soviet columns rumble past the end of streets their orders forbade them to cross. Letters home tried to explain what photographs could not: that they had won the last battle of one war and were now digging in for the first battle of another. Somewhere in New Mexico, scientists raced a different clock that no one in Berlin could hear. In Moscow and Washington, leaders studied maps of Europe with the joy of victory already cooling into calculation. The world had not exploded in April. It had frozen. And the freeze began here, in a city of ash where two flags flew and none could be lowered without starting a fire. Summer 1945 settled over Berlin like smoke that refused to clear. Rubble baked under the sun, and the smell of dust mixed with the sweetness of blooming weeds sprouting through cracked pavement. American engineers rebuilt water lines, strung wires, cleared mines. Soviet work crews did the same across their sectors. But every project, every convoy, every loud sound of a hammer was a message. This city was no longer merely occupied. It was being claimed, inch by inch, ideology by ideology. At first, the uneasy truce held. Joint patrols posed for photographs, brass bands played at improvised victory parades, and Allied officers toasted each other at diplomatic receptions that felt like theater more than celebration. Reporters called it the peace of cooperation. Soldiers called it the quiet before something worse. Behind the smiles, the orders changed. At a 1.0 documentary, rotated fresh divisions into the city under the guise of relief. Soviet garrisons doubled overnight. Both sides dug field depots disguised as reconstruction yards. In late May, the Berlin Kommandatura, the Joint Governing Council, opened its doors inside a half-bombed hotel. 4 flags hung from the rafters: American, British, French, and Soviet. They represented unity. They concealed suspicion. Meetings began with handshakes and ended with arguments about ration allocations, prisoner exchanges, and which streets belonged to which patrols. Translators struggled to keep pace with the rising tension. Each word felt like a grenade pin being pulled halfway out. The city's civilians adapted faster than the diplomats. On the western streets, black markets bloomed. Cigarettes, coffee, nylons, and chocolate replaced the Reichsmark as the only currency people trusted. In the east, ration cards were stamped with red ink, and posters of Stalin promised food for loyalty. Families divided by rivers and checkpoints learned to barter across borders that technically didn't exist yet. Mothers sent children to line up for whichever army's kitchen had shorter queues that day. Every Berliner became a statistic in someone's propaganda report. Rumors of German scientists captured by the Americans spread through Soviet headquarters like wildfire. Stalin demanded answers. If they control the minds that built the V2, they control the next war, he told his generals. To him, Berlin was no longer about victory. It was about secrets. Soviet officers began raiding research institutes in their half of the city, hauling off crates of blueprints, engines, and men in lab coats who vanished eastward under guard. American intelligence did the same, quietly flying specialists to hidden bases in the West. The race for the atom had begun, and its starting line was a city still crawling with rubble and corpses. One July evening, a storm rolled across Berlin. Lightning cracked over the ruins as patrols huddled under tarps. Somewhere near the Brandenburg Gate, an American sentry and a Soviet soldier shared a cigarette in silence, using gestures more than words. When the rain ended, they went back to aiming rifles at the same empty intersection. The peace of convenience continued, but beneath it, the structure of confrontation had already solidified. In Washington, Truman read daily reports from Berlin with mounting frustration. His advisors urged him to maintain control of the city at all costs. Morale in Europe depended on it. "If we pull back, every liberated nation will think we are afraid of Stalin," one memo warned. Truman agreed. American radio broadcasts from Berlin grew sharper, full of speeches about democracy, free markets, and rebuilding. Across the border, Soviet transmitters answered with slogans about unity, anti-fascism, and the betrayal of the capitalist class. Loudspeakers pointed across canals like artillery. The propaganda war had its first front line. Meanwhile, Patton became restless again. The man who had taken Berlin could not stomach watching it dissolve into political theater. In speeches to his staff, he warned that the Soviets were fortifying their sector and arming the local police.
"They're not allies, they're occupiers with better timing," he growled. His words made their way to newspapers, then to Congress. Washington reprimanded him for unhelpful commentary. Patton stared at the reprimand, said nothing, and returned to inspecting his troops. But the seed was planted. Within months, he would be relieved of command, his warnings dismissed as impatience. History would later read them as prophecy. By August, the first borders were drawn on maps, not official frontiers, but administrative zones. Colored pencils divided the city into grids. Where lines crossed neighborhoods, families found themselves citizens of different futures. On one side, American trucks delivered flour, typewriters, jazz records. On the other, Soviet soldiers distributed pamphlets and rebuilt factories under state control. Berlin became the mirror of a world that had split without noticing when. Then came the shock that changed everything. News from the Pacific. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The age of the atom had arrived, announced not in scientific journals, but in fire. The Soviet officers in Berlin received the cables in stunned silence. Their American counterparts pretended calm, but the implications were clear. The United States now possessed a weapon that could erase cities like this one in seconds. Every negotiation, every handshake in Berlin now carried that invisible shadow. The Soviets reacted by sealing off parts of their sector, restricting Allied movement, and accelerating espionage operations. American counterintelligence arrested suspected informants almost daily. A duel of invisible wars began amid the ruins. Code names, safe houses, and whispered exchanges in dark cafes. The OSS turned into the CIA, the NKVD into something new and hungrier. Berlin was both battlefield and laboratory for the world's next conflict. By the end of the year, the illusion of Allied unity was gone. Checkpoints hardened, joint patrols ended, and a line of tension settled through the heart of the capital like a scar that would never heal. Still, no one dared call it what it was. Diplomats used phrases like temporary divergence or administrative disagreements. But the soldiers who stood guard along the canals and railway lines had another term. They called it the front that never sleeps. On Christmas Eve 1945, snow fell over Berlin for the first time since the war's end. Children built snowmen in streets still lined with wrecked tanks. In the western districts, American soldiers handed out candy and sang carols. In the east, Soviet troops watched in silence from checkpoints, their breath turning to mist in the cold. Between them stretched the new world, frozen, fragile, waiting for someone to test how far it could bend before it broke. Winter deepened, and Berlin froze in more ways than one. The snow muffled the ruins, hiding bloodstains and shrapnel under a quiet white sheet. To an outsider, it might have looked peaceful, but every silence hid tension. Patrol boots crunched through the snow along invisible borders. Watchtowers rose where apartment blocks had collapsed. The Allied victory parade of a few months earlier was already a distant dream.
The great alliance that had ended the war now survived only in photographs.
In January 1946, the first walls of words appeared. Not concrete yet, not barbed wire, just paperwork. Every day brought new regulations, travel permits, ration zones, restricted bridges. A woman who crossed town to visit her sister found her pass expired when she tried to return. A merchant who sold American cigarettes in the Eastern District was arrested for economic sabotage. A Soviet officer who drove too far west vanished for a week and reappeared minus his car and his temper. The city was still open, but only because no one had yet decided how to close it. Behind the scenes, the battle for Germany's future had begun. In Moscow, Stalin demanded reparations and obedience. In Washington, Truman demanded reform and elections. Both claimed they wanted peace. Both planned for confrontation. Berlin became the testing ground, a laboratory where each ideology measured its reach. American engineers restored radio stations to broadcast jazz, news, and the promise of democracy. Soviet technicians filled the airwaves with speeches about the workers' triumph and the eternal friendship of peoples. On summer nights, the two signals collided and blended into static that drifted over the sleeping city like a ghost. Patton was gone by then, his warnings dismissed as paranoia. But others took his place. Generals, diplomats, and spies, all convinced that the next war, if it came, would start right here. Maps on their desks turned Berlin into concentric circles of influence. Intelligence analysts colored districts in shades of risk: green for stable, yellow for uncertain, red for infiltration. Every rumor of sabotage, every factory accident, every missing truck was another data point in a new kind of warfare, one fought not with divisions, but with nerves, propaganda, and scarcity. Spring thawed the snow, but not the standoff. The Soviets tightened their control of the eastern rail lines, cutting supplies to western sectors for maintenance. Power outages struck neighborhoods lit by American generators, while Soviet-controlled grids stayed dark deliberately. When Western officials protested, Moscow replied that the city's infrastructure was being rationalization. The phrase became a punchline for every hungry family waiting in line for bread. In April, the first American air convoys began flying in emergency flour shipments. They weren't yet called an airlift, but everyone knew what they were. In the cafes of the western zones, soldiers and journalists argued over what the city had become. Some said it was a symbol of hope, the place where freedom still stood amid the ruins of tyranny. Others called it a trap, a spark waiting for the wrong wind. British officers joked darkly that they were occupying purgatory. French administrators, forever short on manpower, tried to mediate disputes and ended up blamed by both sides. And still the people of Berlin lived their lives between checkpoints, feeding stoves with the wood of broken furniture, trading stolen coal for bread, and pretending that politics was something that happened elsewhere. The summer brought more than heat. In June, the United States announced a new plan to rebuild Europe, the Marshall Plan. It promised billions for recovery, but only to nations willing to cooperate with Washington's vision of free trade and open markets. Stalin saw it as an encirclement wrapped in generosity. His response was swift. Eastern Europe would rebuild itself under Soviet guidance, and Berlin, though shared on paper, would serve as a showcase of socialist strength. Propaganda posters multiplied overnight. Smiling workers raising hammers, slogans about unity, factories reborn under red banners. The message was clear. While the West rebuilt with money, the East would rebuild with will. But money flowed faster than will. By autumn, Western Berlin gleamed faintly with neon signs and shopfronts stocked by American convoys. Theaters reopened, jazz clubs thumped with music, and newspapers printed in English and German called it the city of survival. Across the river, the eastern districts marched to different rhythms. Parades of youth brigades, speeches about collectivization, and long evenings of power cuts. Two Berlins coexisted, facing each other across canals like twins raised by rival parents. For Washington, the city became a moral anchor. For Moscow, a bleeding wound. Both sides poured resources into the illusion of normality, even as spies prowled every bar and boarding house. American intelligence smuggled cameras to photograph Soviet train schedules. Soviet agents bribed dock workers to copy shipment manifests. Somewhere under the broken roof of an old police building, the first East German security service began taking shape, trained by NKVD officers who had once interrogated Nazis and now studied Americans with the same cold method. By winter 1946, Berliners spoke of the curtain. The phrase started as a joke. People said you could almost see a curtain of smoke dividing the city when Soviet coal plants belched eastward. But the joke hardened into prophecy. Churchill's famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, gave the metaphor a name, the Iron Curtain. In Berlin, it wasn't a line on a map. It was the feeling in the air when you walked too far east or west, and the faces around you stopped smiling. That Christmas, American chaplains held midnight mass in the ruins of a bombed-out church. Outside, snow fell again, silent and heavy. The congregation sang Silent Night, their voices rising into the cold. Across the street, a Soviet patrol paused to listen. For a moment, the music bridged everything: politics, fear, exhaustion. When it ended, the soldiers moved on, boots crunching in rhythm. The last note faded, and Berlin returned to its uneasy peace. The new year dawned with searchlights sweeping the night sky, not for enemy planes, but for symbolism. The war that had destroyed Europe was over, yet the peace that replaced it was already crumbling into factions. The American flag still flew over the Reichstag, faded and frayed from a year of wind and smoke. Below it, the city breathed, divided and alive, waiting for someone to decide whether it would be a beginning or an end. Spring 1947 came with gray skies and restless hearts. Berlin had survived the war, but not the peace. Every district had its rhythm now. The American zones alive with markets and motion. The Soviet half grimly efficient and suspicious of joy. Children in the West played with tin toys stamped Made in USA. Children in the East paraded in uniforms 2 sizes too big, carrying flags instead of footballs. The city was learning to speak 2 dialects of survival. Every morning, trains rolled into the western stations from the countryside, carrying refugees who had slipped past Soviet checkpoints. They arrived thin, silent, and terrified. Some carried suitcases, some carried nothing at all. They said little, but their faces spoke volumes. They had seen what it meant to live under the liberation Stalin promised. Western reporters filled their notebooks with quiet horror, forced collectivization, purges, disappearances. The people of Berlin read those reports and understood the truth that governments still refused to say aloud. The war had changed its shape, not its nature. In March, the Soviets cut rail access again, claiming technical difficulties. Food shipments stalled, and the lights dimmed in the western sectors. Eisenhower, now chief of staff, warned Truman that Moscow was testing resolve. "If we blink," he said, "they'll close the city entirely." The president nodded. He had no intention of blinking. Orders went out to stockpile fuel, ration supplies, and prepare for a prolonged logistical contest. It was the beginning of what would become the first great confrontation of the Cold War, though no one yet dared call it that. By summer, tensions boiled. Soviet troops harassed Allied convoys, demanding to inspect every crate. American soldiers stood their ground, staring down barrels at checkpoints where the air itself seemed to crackle with danger. Local radio in the East broadcast warnings of imperialist aggression. In the West, American transmitters replied with swing music and the voice of a calm announcer reminding Berliners that freedom will not freeze. Propaganda became the soundtrack of life, louder than bombs, more constant than silence. Behind the rhetoric, both sides prepared for a showdown. Soviet planners drew up scenarios for sealing the city completely, confident that the Americans would withdraw rather than risk war over a half-ruined capital.
In Washington, air logistics experts met in cramped offices, sketching flight routes on cigarette-stained maps. They had an audacious idea. If the Soviets cut the roads, the Allies would feed Berlin from the sky. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only option. In early June 1948, the impossible happened. Soviet troops closed all land routes into western Berlin. Trains stopped. Trucks were turned back. Barges on the canals were searched, seized, or sunk. The western zones were cut off. 2 million civilians surrounded by an army that had once been their ally. Soviet newspapers called it an administrative reorganization. Everyone else called it what it was, a blockade. The first days were chaos. Shop shelves emptied within hours. People lined up at bakeries that had no flour, at pumps that had no fuel. Streetcars stopped running. Hospitals rationed electricity. The city that had already lived through hunger once before felt the cold breath of starvation again. And yet there was no panic, only defiance. Berliners had seen worse, and this time the bombs weren't falling.
If they could endure the war, they could endure this. On June 26th at Tempelhof Airfield, the first American C-47 touched down, its engines screaming through the gray dawn. It carried flour, milk, and medicine. Within hours, more planes followed, then more, dozens, then hundreds. The air above Berlin became a highway of wings. British Dakotas, American flying fortresses, even converted bombers. Anything that could fly and carry cargo joined the mission. Pilots called it Operation Vittles. Berliners called it Hope. Day and night the planes came, guided by flares, by radio, by faith. Each flight was a victory. Children gathered near the airfields to watch the aircraft descend, waving flags made from scraps of cloth. One pilot began dropping candy tied to tiny parachutes, a gesture that would become legend. Newspapers around the world printed photographs of smiling kids chasing sweetness falling from the sky. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The same planes that had once destroyed cities were now feeding them. The Soviets were furious. Their blockade was supposed to break Western will, not inspire it. They jammed radio signals, shone searchlights into cockpits, buzzed the corridors with fighter jets. But Truman refused to back down. "We stay in Berlin," he said, period. Every week the tonnage increased. By autumn, Allied aircraft were delivering more supplies by air than the city had ever received by rail. The unthinkable had become routine. Meanwhile, the people adapted. Families learned to cook with powdered eggs, to light rooms with candles, to boil water from melted snow. Coal rations barely warmed one room per apartment, but they managed. Berliners joked that they were powered by stubbornness. American engineers kept the generators running. German mechanics scavenged parts from wrecked cars to repair the airfield lights. The sound of engines overhead became the heartbeat of freedom. The blockade lasted 11 months. 11 months of sleepless pilots, freezing workers, and hungry children. 11 months of tension where one mistake could have triggered war. And then, in May 1949, the Soviets blanked. They reopened the roads, pretending the blockade had never existed. They had lost the contest of endurance. The Americans had done the impossible, fed a city without firing a shot. When the first convoy of trucks rolled back into Berlin, people lined the streets cheering. They waved flags, American, British, French, symbols of gratitude that no one could fake. For the first time in years, the western half of the city felt united in more than survival. They had chosen their side. Across the river, the Soviet banners still flew. But something fundamental had shifted. The Kremlin had learned that the West would not yield. And the world had learned that Berlin was not just a city. It was a promise, one that would divide the planet for generations. As the planes finally quieted and the streets filled with life again, one could look up at the Reichstag and see, still fluttering in the wind, a tattered American flag. It was faded now, its colors dulled by rain and exhaust,
but it remained.
For the men who had lifted it, for the people who lived under it, that flag had become more than cloth. It was the answer to the question history kept asking: what if America had invaded Berlin first? Because in this world they had, and everything that followed was proof that victory wasn't just about winning the war, but surviving the peace. By 1950, the scars of Berlin had faded just enough for weeds to grow through them. Children born after the war now played among the ruins without remembering what the noise of guns had sounded like. The airlift had ended, but its echo remained. The low hum of cargo planes overhead, the rhythm of engines that had once meant hope. The city was still divided, though no treaty admitted it. West Berlin glowed with the lights of cafes and cinemas. East Berlin marched to the beat of parades and slogans. The border between them ran like a fault line through the heart of Europe. For Washington, Berlin had become proof that democracy could stand its ground against tyranny without firing a shot. For Moscow, it was a reminder that even victory could be stolen by endurance. Each side built its future around that lesson. The Americans formed new alliances, first with Britain and France, then with the rest of Western Europe. They called it NATO, a shield against whatever the next storm might bring. The Soviets answered with their own pact, binding half a continent behind red banners. The line that had once been a few tense streets in Berlin now stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans, a scar across the map of the world. George Patton did not live to see it. He died months after the war in a car accident that conspiracists never stopped whispering about. In this version of history, his legend burned brighter. He was remembered not as the general who wanted to fight the Russians, but as the man who had taken Berlin and held it without letting the world burn. Statues were raised, books were written, and generations of soldiers studied his audacity. Yet even in triumph, his prophecy had come true. The Allies had won the war only to find another waiting on the same ground. President Truman carried the burden longer. The Berlin crisis had forged him into the kind of leader history rarely grants twice. When the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, he was not surprised. He simply nodded and said, "The race was always going to start here." The arms race, the intelligence wars, the proxy conflicts, all of them could trace their origins to the rubble around the Reichstag, where one flag had replaced another and the world had drawn its breath. For Berliners, history never stopped being personal. The airlift pilots became legends, their photographs pinned beside family icons. In the West, streets were named after them. In the East, their names were erased from textbooks. Yet through the noise of politics, ordinary people kept doing what they had always done: repair, rebuild, endure. Markets reopened, orchestras played again, and lovers met under the same broken streetlights. The city refused to die. In the 1950s, new construction rose where the war had left craters. Glass towers beside gutted churches, steel bridges over rivers that had carried both aid and fear. But even as concrete replaced rubble, the wound of division deepened. Propaganda towers became radio masts, watchposts became fortresses. The wall was still years away, but the idea of it already existed, in whispers, in glances, in the quiet decision not to cross to the other side. The Cold War was no longer just politics, it was the way Berlin breathed. Yet in this alternate history, something else survived. The flag that had been raised over the Reichstag in 1945 still flew above the Western government quarter, faded, patched, but untouched. Veterans returning years later would stop beneath it, remove their hats, and remember the day they thought the war had truly ended. Some smiled, others shook their heads. They knew better now. Wars never end the way they begin. They only change uniforms. Tourists came later, decades later, when Berlin was once again whole. They photographed the restored dome of the Reichstag, unaware of how close that building had come to being the spark of another world war. Guides told them stories, how the Americans had reached the city first, how the Soviets had paused at its gates, how the Cold War had started not with a bomb, but with silence between two allies who no longer trusted each other. And somewhere in those retellings, the truth blurred into legend, because legends are easier to carry than memory. In archives, dusty and dim, a photograph survives. An American sergeant standing on the roof of the Reichstag, wind tugging at the stars and stripes behind him. He looks young, too young to have carried the weight of empires on his shoulders. His name is lost to history, but the moment is not. That image became the symbol of a century, the proof of what could have been and what it cost to make it so. Outside, Berlin moves on. The traffic hums, the lights glow, and the city that once divided the world now hosts conferences about unity. The ghosts remain, quieter now, watching from the shadows of rebuilt walls. The war they fought is gone, but the question they left behind still lingers, whispered in every classroom, every monument, every flag that catches the wind. What if America had invaded Berlin first? In this world, it did. And the world that followed was forever shaped by that single, impossible decision. The moment one flag replaced another, and history turned its page not with peace, but with the promise of another struggle waiting just beyond the smoke.